I'm grateful to the person who first told me the story of Port Chicago when I came to the Park District 7 years ago, the Park District's Chief of Planning, Brian Holt. I suspect that for many people in this meeting, Brian was their first storyteller for this story too. For the past 15 years, Brian has been working in collaboration with Reverend Diana and the Friends of Port Chicago and the National Park Service to learn this history, how it relates to our future regional park, and to continue to tell the story. It's an honor to introduce Brian today and hand over this presentation to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Brian Holt, Chief of Planning, Trails, and GIS. It is an honor to be here to the Executive Committee and presenting on this important decision. So I am going to share my screen and we're going to dive into the presentation here. A lot of the historic background around Port Chicago, the Port Chicago 50 and Thurgood Marshall, I think were captured well in the staff report and staff materials. So what I'm going to present to you here today is, of course, the naming recommendation, but some of the process of how we've gotten here, what's included in the land use plan, and just some of the other considerations there. So I wanted to start out with this photo because I think it's striking in that this is what the public has experienced of this property since the 1940s. It has been a restricted area where people have not been able to access, and just one of our most important goals is to work towards providing access to this property, providing access to all, and making this site welcome. And as Christina says, the recommendation of Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Port Chicago 50, explicitly welcomes the African-American community to this site, celebrates the African-American history, and really pays tribute to the bravery and the courage of the Port Chicago 50. So that is the recommendation of staff, is to accept that name. I do want to acknowledge that this is a community recommendation. This name was generated by a series of community groups, and I do want to recognize our own Black employees, the Citizens for Historical Equity, the Friends of Port Chicago, the NAACP, and everybody who's engaged to come together around this name and embrace it. Next steps will be, we bring it to the Park Advisory Committee, May 24th, 2021, should the Executive Committee support it, and then we will bring it to the full board on June 1st, 2021. And just for reference on the side here, we do have a picture of the Port Chicago 50 on the pier, of course, Thurgood Marshall, and Spencer Sykes Sr., who was one of the sailors there. And I had the pleasure of working with Spencer Sykes Jr. For many years as he served on the board of the Friends of Port Chicago. So very close history. I do want to acknowledge this is the ancestral homeland of the Chukon people, and their stories are important. And I do want to acknowledge the many Native people who engaged in our conversation on this, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in the presentation. But this is the location of the site. We are talking about 2,540 acres located on the former inland area of the Concord Naval Weapons Station, the former Concord Naval Weapons Station. And this property really forms the green belt between the cities of Concord and Pittsburgh. Of course, the city of Concord has development plans for their Concord Reuse Project area. Similarly, Pittsburgh has development plans for their side of the property, their side of the other side of the hill there. And then north of Highway 4, you can see where the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial is, and Military Ocean Terminal Concord, MACO. That's the Army base that is still very much in active operation. So just real quick, going over some of the park features. Again, this will be a 2,540 acre regional park. Just for context, that's twice the size of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and would be one of our larger parks. This future regional park provides expansive views of Mount Diablo, the Diablo Valley, and the San Francisco San Joaquin Delta. We have inherited a vast network of former Navy infrastructure, including many miles of abandoned rail lines and roadways that'll serve as the base for a network of new planned trails, over 22 miles of new trails throughout the property. And then we have the military infrastructure that includes approximately 70 munition magazines that are spread throughout the site, and really serve as a dominant feature of the landscape. They're sort of gracefully tucked into hills in different places, or groupings of magazines on the floor, and they're really inescapable and really define the site. These magazines provide a great opportunity for creative reuse and interpretation of the property's history. And our land use plan has contemplated a number of different reuse scenarios of these various magazines. And you can see the interior of one of the sites here, and then just a rendering of possibilities of how the exterior could be repurposed. And then we have a number of buildings on the property, including this building, IA 24, Inland Area 24 building. It's a former maintenance building that's in the center of the property. And this is the building that we have always envisioned as the future visitor center that would serve to tell the story of Port Chicago and serve the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, and also be a space where, you know, all the stories of the property could be told. So this visitor center will focus on the history of Port Chicago, its aftermath, and the role it played in our nation's ongoing struggle for civil rights. We have a number of other buildings that are also proposed for repurposing, either as outdoor classrooms, of course, maintenance and operations facilities, and archive facilities. So just want to go through some of the background here, because I think it's relevant and it's important to sort of understand the journey that we've been on this property. So 1942 is when the Port Chicago Naval Magazine was originally established. And that initially just included the 7,600 acre tidal area, the area north of Highway 4. And at that point, it was a transfer depot. There was no on-site storage. So munitions would be shipped in from all across the US and come here, and, you know, trains would sort of stack up, and there was, you know, a need to unload the trains as quickly as possible. And that really led to some of the unsafe working conditions that required speedy unloading of trains and onto ships. But the site was also operated as a segregated facility. So the most dangerous jobs went to African Americans, as white officers ordered them to unload these trains. And that ultimately led to the explosion at Port Chicago on July 17, 1944. Whereas we know 320 men died, over 2/3 of them African American, and then of course the events that ensued after that with the unjust mutiny trial, and the involvement of Thurgood Marshall, and ultimately the events that led to the desegregation of the military in 1948. In 1945, the inland portion was purchased, and this was in response to the explosion at Port Chicago. It was to provide for additional storage to address those safety concerns that had become so evident as a result of the explosion. Of course, it was later renamed to the Concord Naval Weapons Station and continued to operate throughout the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Was a site of protest during many military engagements, until it was ultimately closed, the inland area, in 1999. In 2005, it was officially closed. That's when the tidal area was transferred to the Army, whereas continues to be operated as Military Ocean Terminal Concord. In 2006, the Concord Reuse Project was initiated to evaluate the reuse of the full 5,200 acre property. In 2010, the reuse plan was adopted, designating that site designating approximately 2,540 acres of the site for a new regional park. And then plus significant development within the EDC area, the Economic Development Conveyance property, on the city side. So that's 12,000 new homes, 6 million square feet of commercial. We, the East Bay Regional Park District, also work closely with National Park Service and Friends of Port Chicago in helping to write the legislation that established the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. And what was included in that legislation was specific authorization for the National Park Service to partner with the East Bay Regional Park District to develop a visitor center that would highlight the history of Port Chicago. And then between 2010, 2019, a really significant period of just ongoing planning and negotiations and conversations regarding the biologic opinion for the property, all of the real estate necessary to facilitate transfer of the property until ultimately we accepted possession of the future regional park site in 2019. And then in 2020, we adopted the Concord Hills Land Use Plan, guiding the future park development of the site. So the naming process. So the naming process has really been ongoing throughout the public land use plan process. Names were solicited throughout the entire process. During every public meeting, public hearing. We had opportunities for the public to provide suggestions on names. We engaged in a number of individual conversations around the park names during the public workshops, and then also garnered input during a number of Port Chicago commemoration events that happened on the property. A survey of the top names were circulated by the City of Concord, City of Pittsburgh, Save Mount Diablo, and East Bay Regional Park District. We received, I think, over 1,500 responses of those. We also included just a open-ended suggestion where additional names and comments could be offered. And certainly we heard a lot of interest in a Port Chicago affiliated name on that, as well as a name that reflected the Native American history of the property. So the survey results and other suggestions were presented to the Park Advisory Committee and the Executive Committee. The survey, there was broad support for just the name Concord Hills, but we also communicated that themes supporting either Native American history or Port Chicago history also emerged. At that time, the PAC and Executive Committee directed staff to engage with Native peoples to explore a possible Native affiliated name. Through a series of meetings with Native tribal leaders, we developed a couple names and presented those to the Executive Committee. And that's where we really started to see a lot of broad interest and communicated that this site should be named to reflect the Port Chicago history and the African American history of this site. We continued to engage in conversations with both tribal leaders and the various groups that were supportive of an African American affiliated name. And of course, have continued to hear from everybody during our various public meetings. And then just clearly a broad coalition have emerged that supports the Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Port Chicago 50 name, which brings us here today. So why does staff support this name? One, we have seen that there's broad community support, and that's important. Certainly celebrates a prominent leader who fought for civil rights for all. As Christina mentioned, a long history of fighting for Native American sovereignty, of course, African American equal justice, and just a long and storied history. And it provides immediate educational opportunities regarding our nation's past and our continued struggle for civil rights. And certainly we've seen a number of people that continue to understand this story and bring it forward and really are embracing it. And I think that's so important. And then, as Christina mentioned, just the broader themes of social justice, protest, and resilience that really provide an opportunity for deep storytelling of the site's history and all the stories on the property. There were a number of conversations about the tagline, home of Port Chicago 50. And it was really, talking with some of our colleagues and some of the other groups, the Citizens Committee for Historic Equity, that I really came to understand just, the importance and significance of this tagline and recognizing the Port Chicago 50. The bravery of the Port Chicago 50 to, during an era of segregation and Jim Crow, to step up and protest an order from the Navy. We often hear about the bravery of people like Rosa Parks and others, which certainly not diminishing that, but we have not heard enough about the Port Chicago 50. of course, this was an early act of organized civil disobedience, calling for safer working conditions. This is a labor story as much as anything else. As Christina mentioned, Black sailors were not welcome in the town of Port Chicago. And just the significance of their protest and the national attention that it garnered directly led to the desegregation of the military. But we also heard just the significance of the word home to the historically excluded African-American community. And that's certainly something as a white male, I wasn't able to see very, evidently right in front of me. And I really appreciate just hearing from my friends and others, just what the significance of that and having a place specifically designated to celebrate African-American history, what that would mean. So I just want to take a moment to kind of pause and reflect on who the Port Chicago 50 are. We also often talk about them as a group, but these were all men with names and families. Many of them were teenagers. They signed up to serve their country and wished to do so honorably, and they were treated horribly by our country. Their service has never been properly recognized, and I just think it's important that we reflect on who they are. And also I think important to understand that each of these men had stories after their protest, after their service, and I think it's part of the power of the recognizing the Port Chicago 50 is to understand those stories and to understand just how this event impacted their lives and how we can make sure that we never repeat that history. So of course, the consideration and the direction to name this property after Native peoples is certainly in keeping with the Park District's mission, and something that we need to continue to find opportunities to honor Indigenous history and acknowledge Native peoples today. I think part of the benefit of this process has been understanding that, and part of these conversations, recognizing that there's a broad constellation of actions that the Park District can take to honor Indigenous history and to acknowledge Native people. Certainly we can consider actions like designation of cultural easements or joint stewardship opportunities at sacred sites. That was some of the feedback that we did hear from Native people specifically was, names are important, but they also really would welcome a greater connection to the land through the Park District, and that's something that we can explore. We would love to work with Native people on developing a more formal land acknowledgement process that ensures accurate land acknowledgement on all of our park signage, maps, and interpretive materials. We are slated to begin, and we need to develop a cultural resource management plan for the East Contra Costa County Habitat Conservation Plan area. This includes Deer Valley, Clayton Ranch, some 15,000 acres of property that has significant cultural resources. And so this is an opportunity to really work in partnership with Native people in that. And then of course we can explore future naming opportunities at our currently unnamed parklands like Clayton Ranch or Deer Valley, Vasco Hills, Doolin Canyon, and other sites. I do want to acknowledge this is one of the stories that we had heard from Native people as we were engaged with them was about this healing pole that exists down in Indian Canyon down near the Hollister area. This pole was carved from a salvaged piece of Alaskan cedar that survived the Port Chicago explosion. And I believe we have a video from one of the Native people that we worked with describing the significance of this pole later. So I just want to acknowledge and just deep thanks to all of the tribes that engaged in the naming discussion. So they're listed here. They gave of their time generously and offered their stories and their history and really engaged with staff And I specifically want to acknowledge Devin Reef, who facilitated a really great outreach process, very respectful outreach process, and working with people to develop names and to also follow up with them as recently as yesterday to make sure that they understood what staff's recommendation was and the reasoning for it, and again the opportunities to continue to partner and work with Native people. So looking to the future, as I've said before, I think one of my goals is I want to get this property open to the public so people can enjoy it. So we did adopt a land use plan. It was approved in July 2020, included 22 miles of trails, group camping facilities, picnicking, outdoor classrooms, like I say, the interpretive reuse of magazines, the visitor center that we've discussed, and significant areas designated specifically for natural and cultural resource protection. This is a big site with a lot of opportunities to tell the full broad history of this property, the Native history, the history of protests during the Vietnam War, just the Rancho history, and an opportunity to really celebrate and embrace the African American history here. And then just wanted to highlight the visitor center that is proposed in the land use plan, that is approved in the land use plan. This partnership that we have with National Park Service that was authorized through the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial Enhancement Act. We have the cooperative management agreement between National Park Service and East Bay Regional Park District that was signed in 2015. It was renewed in 2020. This would serve as the primary park destination, really highlighting the Port Chicago explosion and its aftermath. And it's a large space with facility for community meetings, film showings, symposiums, really an opportunity to provide space for conversations around the site's history and our nation's history. And then of course, this could be an area where folks can actually make reservations and board the shuttle to visit the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial when it's open. Part of the reason why we have worked towards this facility on this site is because the Naval Magazine National Memorial is located on an active Army base. It is not always available to the public, and it is limited to reservations. So this would be a site where the public could access the history and then also could use it to access the actual memorial site. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Again, our recommendation is a strong and full-throated support of a recommendation that has come from the community and is embraced by the community. Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Port Chicago 50. So we ask that the Board Executive Committee recommend that we move that name on to the PAC and the full Board of Directors. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and thank you very much.
We are now, any further comments from the board before we take a vote?
I'm ready to make the motion.
Please do.
So moved.
Second.
That we adopt the staff recommendation to name our beautiful new park the Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Port Chicago 50.
Excellent. And I believe, so we have a motion from Director Corbett and a second from Director Coffey. Madam Secretary, can you please take a roll call?
Yes. Director Corbett?
Aye.
Director Coffey?
Aye.
President Rosario?
Aye.
Okay, perfect.
Unanimous. So the recommendation goes to the full board. Thank you all very much for all your incredible work to get us to this point. And I'm feeling good about it.